To start off this amazing program we have for the night, we have an armchair conversation with these two amazing panelists that you see up here. This conversation is titled, and bear with me, Protect Nature and Reduce Global CO2 Emissions by Building a Global Multi-Trillion-Dollar Barrier-Free Clean Capital Market. I know that sounds like a long with the title, but it's a lot to cover tonight, and we're very excited as we have two people who are going to discuss a pioneering tax CO2 reform. So as exciting as that is, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Sally Ranney, president, as we know, of the American Renewable Energy Institute and co-founder of the International Women's Earth and Climate Network, amongst many other distinguished environmental leadership titles. And she will be talking to Rod Richardson, who is president of the Grace Richardson Fund and responsible for pioneering this carbon tax reform. So give them a round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Vassar. Thank you. So this, it is a long title, but, and there's two really good pieces to this. One is this new, very innovative proposal for clean tax cuts. Can it really make a difference on the ground for reducing CO2 emissions and for protecting nature, some of what we heard about today. So to give you a little bit of background, Rod knocked on our door about 3 years ago, and he told us about this proposal that his foundation, the Grace Richardson Fund, had been working on, he primarily. And we were really intrigued because we hadn't heard anything that was incentive-based versus penalty-based for doing the right thing. So he came and he gave us kind of the raw overview of the clean tax cuts. Well, out of that, that first dialogue, that first session 3 years ago, he then held charrettes all over the country, 11 in total, in different sectors, to get feedback and ideas from ag and forestry, from oil and gas, from real estate, and he got a lot of really good traction in doing that. Then the next step was Andy Sabin, the unforgettable Trammell Crow, who you met today, and Rod established the Clean Capitalist Leadership Council, which is linked in with the Republican Climate Caucus in Congress. So that gives us a little bit of background about this proposal. Now, a lot has progressed since then, so we invited him back. And Rod, I'd like you to tell us a little bit about what has happened since the charrettes and the council has been founded.
Sure. Well, 2017 was a massive charrette marathon. We did so much work in all these different sectors, and so many people participated, including CHIP and AREI and the Nature Conservancy, R Street Institute, Columbia University. Right. We had a lot of brilliant people giving us some good ideas, ASU, and Rocky Mountain Institute was instrumental in suggesting that we develop this using charrette format. Mm-hmm. But those charrettes developed many different kinds of clean tax cut mechanisms for each different sector. You had equity side, clean product tax cuts, you had clean expensing, you had that was immediate expensing for clean investments, you had tax exemption for innovation. Complete tax exemption was a proposal. And then one of the best ideas that we had was the Clean Asset Bond, which came out of Columbia University, which I'll tell you more about in a second. Yeah. But the latest part of the work since the fall of 2017 was to take all those ideas and to try to distill them into the very best ones so that we could come up with a very concrete, simple, but very powerful federal and international proposal.
Yeah.
You know, one of the things that we realized was that, you know, it's not enough to cut taxes on an incentive. You have to design an incentive where you're eliminating all the barriers to participation that could occur. You know, let me give you a concrete.
So this is barrier-free.
This is barrier-free.
To lower the cost of capital?
Right, to lower the cost of capital, to you know, incent investment. But let me just sort of lay out the new proposal, which was really actually only released 3 weeks ago. So, and it's being just circulated among a very small group of policy experts and staffers on Capitol Hill so far. But the proposal for the Barrier-Free Clean Capital Market Act essentially is pretty simple. We use clean asset bonds. Clean asset bonds, these are the core of the act. These were what was developed at Columbia University a year ago. Clean asset bonds are the only tax-exempt bond in the private market. Okay, every other tax-exempt bond you've ever heard of is in the municipal bond market. And that is the wrong market to be in if you want an incentive that can really accelerate investment. It's the government market. You want the corporate market, the private market, because that's where investment has to occur, right? So the clean asset bond is the only incentive that applies policy leverage to financial leverage. Now, what's financial leverage? Financial leverage is a tool that capitalists use all the time. It's a key tool of capitalism. It is private debt, which has a lower cost than equity. Right. Equity holders expect a return, a higher return.
Yeah.
U.S. return on debt is 4%, return on equity is 13%. So equity holders, the owners of a business, they don't want to raise more equity. They want to raise cheap debt to lower their cost of capital. Lowering their cost of capital allows them to produce cheaper products and beat the competition. Okay? It allows them to grow faster, and it allows them to raise the return on equity to give themselves a higher profit. Okay? Those are the major effects of capital. What the clean asset bond does is it magnifies all those effects. So you get a really interesting result.
So how do you define a clean asset? What are the parameters?
Right. Well, you know, it's a little different for every sector, but fortunately, almost one of the reasons we chose the clean asset bond is the clean tax mechanism to go with. There were a lot of different choices.
Right.
But this one was the best because every single sector has clean assets. So a clean asset is something where you have very definable metrics that tell you, how you're reducing pollution or waste or inefficiency. So for instance, the best example, which was, the core of this was something called the emission reduction bond developed by Professor Travis Bradford at Columbia University, applies this to zero emission power sources. Because the zero emission power source is the clearest example of a concrete metric that you can use in this. But they would be, things like net zero buildings would be a good one. Electric vehicles, low emission vehicles. You might apply it to waste recycling. You could apply it to things like carbon capture and storage, or air capture for that matter. You could apply it to, there's a host of things. One of the reasons we use it is there's really a long list of things you could apply it to.
So they're verifiable is the bottom line.
That's right.
Okay.
And one of the key things that we learned as we went into this is The Columbia Charette that designed the clean asset bond designed eight mechanisms. 8 mechanisms. We found out that probably only 3 of them would work. The clean asset bond would work, but the other 5 wouldn't work at all because you know, the way they were structured were much, you know, that they looked at the future environmental performance of the project, and the tax exemption might be lost if the projects didn't perform. In that case, investors wouldn't buy it. Issuers wouldn't issue the bond. You can't use that structure for tax exemption and bonding. You have to use you know, pre-qualified assets, you know, that where the developers know in advance that their project is going to qualify because there's a historical track record for that technology. So, but go ahead.
Well, so the verifiable, the matrix, is a big piece, I know, that before you got to that point was a big question, if what a clean asset was. Now, why, how much money do you think this is, or investment, is this really going to create? It's going to take trillions of dollars of investment to keep us under the 2 degrees or at the 2 degrees Celsius. So what, you know, I've heard you use the word huge. What is that number?
Well, the International Energy Administration, you know, estimates that we're going to need $160 trillion worth of investment over the next 40 years. That's an average of $4 trillion a year. And depending on who you ask, our climate investment today is hovering somewhere between $400 billion to $600 billion. So we're at roughly 10 to 15% of where we should be. So anything that we can do will help. So we need to explore different ways to accelerate this. Now, I can't tell you exactly how much the clean asset bonds are going to accelerate it, but I can tell you this: they're going to accelerate it better than any other incentive that we have. I mean, essentially, if you look at the incentive policies that we have out there, all climate policy, environmental policy that we have was developed 25 to 45 years ago, okay? And it was all developed in an era when clean energy technologies were all unprofitable. And the purpose of those technologies was to support unprofitable businesses. So you use subsidies. You had to use a subsidy. That was the only way to do it. But those kinds of policies are now out of date. That's changed. Wind has become profitable since 2011. You know, solar has achieved a lower levelized cost of electricity than fossil fuels since 2015. So you need to change the policy paradigm.
So what about the tariff, the 30% tariff on PVs, and what the president has done with that, and how, you know, how's that all going to play out?
Well, that's the opposite of a clean tax cut.
That
is the absolute opposite.
Yeah.
And it's a wonderful teaching moment, because I think a lot of people who never really necessarily appreciated the value of free markets or globalization are suddenly saying, wait a minute, we need a free market in this stuff. We need the lack of barriers. We need, you know, we need to knock down the barriers. So what I'm talking about is a policy that reduces and eliminates the barriers to carry. Let me just lay out for you how the new proposal works, because it's very simple. This act would authorize the use of clean asset bonds by a list of technologies, which is you know, shorter than it could be, but we wanted to choose the best ones. And I'll be speaking more about that on Wednesday, and I'll go into detail exactly what they are, et cetera. But clean asset bonds, and we propose a 6-year pilot program with a step down. So it starts with, you can use clean asset bonds the first year to sort of jumpstart the project, you can use it up to 80% of project financing can be clean asset, tax exempt clean asset bonds. And that steps down to 40% in year 5 and 6. So that means that over the life of the pilot program, you're drawing in more and more tax revenue because more and more of the capital stack is going to be taxable, right? But in addition to that, there's another key component of this, and that is that we've built in international reciprocity. In other words, a key part of the act is that any other country that wants to become a cooperating nation, all they need to do is to pass an act that looks the same. And that way, clean asset bonds issued in any cooperating country will be tax exempt to the investors in any cooperating country.
And that's how you're taking it international.
Right.
Obviously,
So
that's
the U.S. could start this first, but Canada could too, or China could too. Any country could too. And what happens is that those countries that join have a massive advantage over those that don't.
Yeah.
Right? Because suddenly lots of money is pouring in. One of the really cool things about this kind of incentive, I mentioned it's the only leveraged incentive. Every other incentive that's out there, only appeals to a very narrow market. I mean, if you look at the ITC or the PTC, only the very richest, highest income taxpayers can benefit from that fully. Only the Berkshire Hathaways of the world can use all of that tax credit. Everybody else has to go to the bankers, okay? And you have to be big enough to go to the bankers, but you're giving up a lot because tax equity trading is very expensive and complicated. Mom and pop can't play in that market. There are many investors that don't want to play in that market. The pension funds are huge investors, but they have no interest in tax credits. They're tax exempt already. So you look at something like the, all the tax exempt bonding, like the private activity bonds that are used for infrastructure, right? Well, that's the wrong market, because the muni bond market is not one big market, which is what we're trying to do. It's 50 markets. So every muni bond, every private activity bond, only appeals to investors in one state.
Yeah.
Okay, we're trying to find an incentive that appeals to everyone in every state, in every country, right? You want a really big market. So you're eliminating, those muni bonds appeal not only just in one state, but only to the high net worth investors, the high net worth individuals in that state. Mom and pop don't really care about the muni bonds. No, neither do that. So what we've done with a clean asset bond is because it's a leveraged incentive, that means that by increasing the return on equity,
Right.
the three effects are to, decrease cost of capital,
Right.
faster growth, higher return on equity. By increasing the return on equity of these projects, you attract every single investor. Okay, it doesn't matter who you are, everybody wants higher return on equity. Mom and pop can play, okay, middle class investors can play, pension funds can play, corporations can play, foreign investors can play, everyone can play in that market. So we've constructed this is the only incentive that I know of that actually incents not just the tax exempt bond, but the taxable investment too.
So are there other countries that, say Canada or Mexico, close neighbors, that you've had any discussions with anyone at a policy level about?
There's only so much that one man can do, but we have one of our partners is the Ocean Recovery Alliance, Doug Woodring, who's worked with Mission Blue, and Sylvia Earle, who you had here today.
Right.
And they've been working with us on figuring out how to apply clean tax cuts to plastic waste. Doug had a chance to talk with the Minister of the Environment for Canada, Catherine McKenna
Yeah.
in Cancun recently, and apparently she ended up wanting to spend the whole day with Doug talking about clean tax cuts. So they're interested and have let Doug know that they would like to have further conversation. So Canada's interested.
Excellent, excellent. Another question.
And but I just want to go back on that.
Okay.
You mentioned Trump and his tariff. What better way to say to Donald Trump than to say, guess what? We're going to start a barrier-free clean capital market. Just the way we have these carbon trading markets. Let's start a barrier-free clean capital market. Right?
So can these bonds be targeted towards drawdown strategies, the top 20 drawdown strategies that Paul Hawken and Catherine Wilkinson put together in the book Drawdown, where the most gigatons in those top 20, can either be sequestered and never go up into the atmosphere, the emissions, or a lot, we have a process where the book really gives you an idea of the gigatons that if we target investment in those strategies, that the top 20, we can almost get to 1,000 gigatons out of the atmosphere per year. So how do you do that, or can you do that? Like refrigeration is number one. Managing refrigeration. Nobody thought of that.
Well, let me just say, this is also under the heading of there's only so much that one man and one organization can do. We've worked with a ton of different people on clean tax cuts. Paul Hawken is I have not yet worked with him on this. So I'd like to, and I'd like to look at it through that lens. But I do believe that the clean tax cuts are so versatile. There are so many different kinds of clean tax cut mechanisms that you can use that I'm pretty sure you could target, something at anything. Though there are situations where, the industry or the sector hasn't gotten itself to the point where you can really use this right. Let me give you an example. Forestry is a pretty good sector where you could do this because they have certification for forestry, right? In America, right? In the United States, you could do certified wood products and it would work pretty well. However, agriculture, there is no agreed upon certification for what constitutes sustainable agriculture. So in order to apply clean tax cuts to agriculture, they would need to figure out the certification, to really do it right.
But there is certification for organic.
Yes, you could apply it to certification for organic, but that's incomplete. There's a lot of sustainable farming methods that would not be included in that, where the farmers would say, hey, why are we being, so you would get resistance because, those guys are getting it, but why aren't we? So there needs to be a little bit more work done in agriculture to develop that certification to get there, though there are things you could do, right?
So we only have a few seconds here. If you could tell us, what is the timing on this, as far as you're saying that it's in Washington, staffers are looking at it. What do you think we're looking at time-wise, as far as a real piece of legislation being introduced and considered?
At the Smith-Richardson Foundation, where I was on the grants board, we pioneered a lot of ideas that became actual legislation. And the time frame that it takes to go from the first introduction of an idea to an actual idea turning into law, is usually somewhere between 4 to 8 years. So we are 2 years into the intellectual development cycle of this. And our goal is to really just get this idea on the table, get a couple of candidates talking about it, and raising it as an idea that, not even that they're proposing a bill, but that they want to explore, further. That will set us up for possibly the first legislative efforts on this in 2019, 2020. Policy development is a long game. It's not, you're not going to get instant gratification on public policy stuff. It takes time.
But if this could get moving in 2020,
Yes.
with the presidential election, and just as you were saying about Trump,
Yeah.
it says we're going to go ahead anyway, regardless of your tariffs or your administration's policies, that private industry can do this. I think that could be a really good play for the presidential election.
I agree, but not only that, we're developing this so that any country could pick this up too. It doesn't have to be the United States.
So I want to thank Rod for being with us tonight, and he has spent a lot of 110% of his time on this, and I think that there's some real possibility here. So please give him a hand, and don't hesitate to talk with him.
Yeah, please, everybody, need help in making this happen. So come talk to me if you have any questions. I'd love to talk with you.